So I also want to tell you that this program is being recorded, and within a couple weeks, it will be on our website for you to listen to. madaboutartdenver.com, and all of our lectures on Zoom are on that for you to watch. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm just still letting a few people in. So let me double check on, all right, so far we have 27 people. Very nice turnout. So I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis. Would you please introduce Georgie?
Yes, I would be happy to. Georgie Contiguglia served for a decade as president and CEO of History Colorado, which was formerly Colorado Historical Society. She also served as the state's Historic Preservation Officer. Earlier, she was curator of decorative and fine arts, managing 7 house museums and curating many exhibitions, including the annual Artists of America exhibition. She graduated from Barnard College of Columbia University, majoring in mathematics. She received a master's degree in art history from Hunter College in New York and worked at the Brooklyn Museum of Art and also at the Denver Art Museum. She has taught math and art history in New York and art history at Fort Range Community College in Fort Collins and at the Academy of Lifelong Learning in Denver. She continues to serve on a variety of historic preservation boards and commissions, including the Colorado State Capitol Advisory Committee, which advises the legislature on matters regarding the Capitol's art collection and historic preservation. So welcome, Georgie.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to see if I can bring my presentation up. It'll take a moment. Slideshow. There we go. Okay. I am going to talk today about Artemisi. Oh, somebody coming in.
That's okay, I'll just let them in.
Okay. I'm going to talk actually about a Renaissance and Baroque, mostly Baroque artist, Artemisi Gentileschi. But before I do that, I thought it would be a good idea to give you just a brief update on the monuments, because last year we talked about all the issues around monuments. Well, the issues have not gone away. There's just more constantly. So I have a couple of updates. This is a new sculpture that was commissioned for the Peace Park in Atlanta, Georgia. And it is Chief Tomachichi, who is of the Muskogee tribe. Well, the developer who asked for this, and this is a huge sculpture. You can see up here in the corner the size of the people versus the size of the sculpture. So what they call heroic size, over life size. This has caused quite an uproar because whenever you're dealing with Native American sculpture or interpretation or anything of that sort, you really need to confer with the tribes. And this gentleman, although he is in Atlanta, conferred, he said, with a tribe of Muskogee Indians in Alabama. but they were not related to the tribe of people who were in the Atlanta area. Meanwhile, this Indian is shown with a loincloth and not inappropriate garb that he would have worn. The sculpture is based on an engraving that was done by an Englishman back in the 1700s. And back in those days, they were portraying the Indians as sort of the great savage. So this is the sculpture that they got, and the Indians are very unhappy with it. Meanwhile, back in New York, the sculpture in front of the American Museum of the Museum of the Museum of Native Natural History is the sculpture of Teddy Roosevelt with an American Indian and an African man. And this has been vandalized in the past and recently removed to the tune of about $2 million that the museum had to absorb to do this. Also in New York, in the city council chambers, the Jefferson sculpture was removed because, of course, we know he owned slaves. So that was taken down. I don't know where that went. There was no comment about that I could find. And another sculpture that was added, let her in, is entitled March to Freedom, and it is a sculpture of a man from the United States Colored Troops, and a monument for them, and it's in a park that memorializes other people who have been involved in civil rights. This particular sculpture is for a monument of Union soldiers. So lots going on, some things being added, some things being taken away. The Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia, finally was taken down, and that's going into a warehouse. They haven't determined where that's going to be ultimately. And the Robert E. Lee sculpture that was taken down from Charlottesville is going to be melted down, and here's a cartoon that shows. And the bronze from that will be used for some other kind of monument that will go up, as yet to be determined. So lots going on, and just keep your eyes and ears open when you look at magazines and things, or the newspapers, or the New Yorker, or whatever. You may see some of these things. So more later. There are a couple of really good books on this particular topic, or articles. One here by Aaron Thompson, Rise and Fall of the Public Monuments and Smashing Statues, and then another one, Fallen Idols, 12 Statues That Made History. So if anybody is particularly interested in this topic, you can look online later and get these. So we are now going to talk about Artemisia. This talk came about from a series that I did for the for the Academy of Lifelong Learning on women artists in 2020. 2020 was declared the year of the woman. And so I thought that, I'd talk about women artists in general. We don't usually get to hear too much about them until more contemporary times. In fact, in the old Jansen book, that's sort of the Bible of art history, there were only 5, I think, of women that were mentioned in the entire book. So women artists have been sorely overlooked. And Artemisia is now coming into her own. Right now, the reason I picked her is there are 2 exhibits going on with, here we go. I'm gonna push that over a little bit. 2 exhibits going on, actually 1 exhibit in 2 locations, one at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, and that one has just ended, and the exhibit is going to the Detroit Institute of Art. So if anybody is traveling to Detroit, you'll get a chance to see this exhibition, and I highly recommend it. It's not just about Artemisia, but several other women in her sphere of influence. So the goals today is to give you an overview of her life and her artistic work, and to put her into the context of women artists, primarily in Italy, during the late Renaissance and the early Baroque period. This is an engraving after an unknown artist who did a portrait of her in the latter part of the 1600s, not from life. And just to give you a sense, a little bit of what she looked like. But a real impetus to this talk and others is Linda Nochlin. She's an art historian from NYU. She's subsequently deceased just a few years ago. But in 1971, she wrote a definitive article called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And the reason was, she determined, was that nobody has done the research on them, primarily because the researchers and the people in charge of exhibits in the museums, etc., had been primarily men, and they had overlooked the women. So her research showed that for women artists to succeed, they needed to have particular confidence in their ability, the support of their family or community, and opportunities. And back in the Renaissance and in the Baroque period, these were very hard things for women to come by. There had also been sort of a myth that there was a woman's style. And the reason they thought this is because oftentimes the paintings that women did were of other women and children. And the reason for that is because those were the subjects that they had easy access to. Women in the early days, that we're talking Renaissance and Baroque period and into the 19th century, women were not allowed to attend art school, to attend life classes, to attend anything where the men were the subjects, the models. They couldn't go to life classes where there were men. And so the things they had easy access to were the women who lived around them, their family, their mothers, their sisters, and the children. But Linda found in her research that within a generation, a woman's artistic style was really of her time. If she were a Renaissance woman, her style represented that. If she were lived in the 19th century Romantic era, her paintings also reflected that, her style. And so we find that is the case also with Artemisia, and we'll see that as we go along. So here's another engraving, but this one done after a self-portrait and done by Jerome David. However, this is, I wonder if I can get rid of this up here. No, go back. Okay. There we go. I have a little doodah up on the top of my screen that blocks other things. All right, not going to happen. Okay, so this is a portrait, again, a portrait of Artemisia, but not a self-portrait. She did not do this. It was done by a French artist. And notice on her bodice, this little medallion in the middle of her bodice, sort of over her breast. And I have an enlargement of it. It is a painting of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus that was built by the widow of King Mausolus. Thus we get the name mausoleum. And the queen's name was Queen Artemisius. So this portrait of Artemisia is in fact equating her with the queen. Queen Artemisia. So it is something that is a compliment to the artist and shows that she is held in great esteem. In 1625, this painting or drawing was done by Pierre Dumonstier, just a drawing of her hand, her very delicate hand, which in fact you can kind of see in this portrait. So the inscription on the top of it says, "This last of December 1625, after the dignified hand of the excellent and learned Artemisia, gentle lady of Rome." And on the back, it said, "The hands of Aurora are praised and renowned for their rare beauty, but this one is 1,000 times more worthy because it has the knowledge to make marvels that send the most judicious eyes into rapture." So I show you these things because the point I want to make is that Artemisia, during her lifetime, was held in great esteem. She was highly regarded. Other artists adored her, and her patrons also adored her because she had many. So she was an outstanding artist. She was very, very well known. So now we'll get to see some of her own work, keeping this in mind. Artemisia was born in Rome. I have to catch my up to this. She was the eldest daughter of another artist. His name was Orazio Gentileschi. She had a couple of brothers. Her mother died when Artemisia was 12 years old, and she was then put in charge of taking care of the house and taking care of her brothers. Not an unusual thing to happen in a family. Probably her mother maybe died in childbirth. I don't know for sure. But anyway, she was put in charge of the family. At the age of 16, however, her younger brothers were installed in the workshop, the artistic workshop of her father. Back in the Baroque period, in the 1600s, the way you learned to be an artist was to be apprenticed to another artist. This is how you also learned to be a blacksmith or a goldsmith or anything of this sort. Became an apprentice. Now, for boys, it was okay in those days for a boy to be apprenticed to a man in another family, an artist in another family, and then to go and live with that family while he was studying. Not so for a woman. The only reason that a woman could study was if she were studying with someone in her own family. Thus, Artemisia was allowed to join the workshop of her father and her brothers. And quickly she surpassed her brothers in talent, and her father recognized this. Her father had several other people in his employ. He had a workshop where he had many commissions, and he had other artists work with him on these commissions. One of the artists that he employed was a man by the name of Agostino Tazzi, and they were working together on a commission to decorate the interior of a palazzo in Rome. During this time, Tazzi stalked Artemisia. She was about 17 at this time. And ultimately, he went to the house, her father's house, and he raped the woman. There was another woman in the house, sort of a chaperone, shall we say, for Artemisia, who ignored the cries of Artemisia, and poor Artemisia was raped. Tazzi promised to marry her, but quickly reneged on it, probably because she didn't get pregnant, and he figured he was off the hook. And so Artemisia's father took him to court. And there was a big trial about the rape. During the trial, Artemisia was examined by prosecutors. She was tortured to make sure she was telling the truth, questioned at length, called a whore, but she stuck to her story. And ultimately, Tazzi was accused and found guilty. He was sent out of Rome and for a year, but it never came to pass. He stayed in Rome the whole time. However, her father then arranged a marriage for Artemisia to another artist, Pier Antonio Stiatisi. He was a Florentine artist. And the following year, the two of them moved to Florence. Now, there's a lot known about Artemisia because of the trial. And the trial was documented, written down. The whole process, the whole proceedings of the trial were written down. And the trial documents were found in the 1800s by an art historian who was doing some research. So it tells a lot about women during this time, artists during this time, the morals of this time, et cetera, et cetera. Not a great time for women, and we know that there are parts of the world where it's still not a great time for women. This is, on the left, the first painting that we have known by Artemisia. It's Susanna and the Elders. This is an apocryphal story. Susanna was the wife of a wealthy man who used to entertain many people, elders in the community. And one day when she was in her garden bathing, two men spied upon her and decided they would have their way with her. So they approached her. There was an older man and a younger man. And they said that if she would not submit to their desires, they would report to her husband that she had lain with a lover in the garden. She refused to do this, and so the two men did report to the husband on her that the made-up lie. However, the husband questioned them and said, well, under what tree did they lie? And he asked each of the two men separately that question, and they each gave different answers. Therefore, he believed his wife, and the men were gone from them. The fact that he had to question them at all, however, tells you more about the time than you might want to know. It's questionable who the two men are, and some scholars think that the younger man is the artist Tazzi, who had raped Artemisia, and that the older man is Cosimo Cuorli, who was complicit in the rape. He was an assistant to the Pope, or in the Pope's entourage, let's say. And of course, the woman resisting would have perhaps been a picture of Artemisia herself. The picture kind of looks like it might be. So the story has some symbolic meaning, some historical meaning. But I want to talk a little bit about the style because it's very typical of the Baroque era. The Baroque era tended to focus the subject matter in kind of a stage setting. They brought the subject matter up close to the picture plane. And you can see this is a very shallow space. The woman has a fence or a bench or something behind her. The men are leaning over. They're very, very close to the viewer. There's a sky behind that kind of is not so important. The real action is happening right up in front. Also, there is a very strong light and dark, chiaroscuro, in the picture. which is another element that you find in Baroque painting and something that was particularly highly regarded and used by the artist Caravaggio. Now, on the right at the top, I put one of the Sistine Chapel frescoes by Michelangelo that shows a pose that's somewhat similar to the woman in the Artemisia sculpture. And then another one down below of Susanna and the elders. It was a popular, let's say, a popular topic. And this one done by Peter Paul Rubens about a decade before this one was done by Artemisia. Remember, Artemisia did her studying in Rome, and there were many fabulous artists there. She would have been very well acquainted with the art circles in that city. Likewise, when she went to Florence with her husband was part of the art circle, and she would have had access to artist studios with him and collections of artwork in that city. So she was very well educated in art, let's just put it that way, not only in the technique, but in what was going on around her in art circles. This is another painting by Artemisia, Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist. Susanna and the elders was a very popular topic. Salome and John the Baptist, another one. Many artists picked these topics. They were thought to have a moral to them, and so they were thought to be edifying, I guess, to the people who looked at them. Again, the subjects are up close, a lot of light and dark shadow. We don't know what's going on behind. It's a moment of drama when the head is shown to Salome. So these are things that are explored, let's say, by Baroque artists. Notice that although the subjects here, the women in particular, I'll point out, are biblical, their clothing tends to be contemporary with the Baroque era. And you'll find that as we go along, so just keep your eye out for that. When Artemisia and her husband moved to Florence, she was, I think, very readily accepted into the art circles. And her reputation, I'm sure, preceded her. She was asked to decorate the ceiling of the Casa Buonarroti. This was a building, a home of the grandnephew of Michelangelo. It wasn't Michelangelo's home, it was a relative of his. So she did what's called the allegory, the title, the Allegory of Inclination. Inclination meaning sort of innate talent. And she's shown with a compass that is showing her pointing the way and a star overhead. So she is following her dream, following her star, which is what let's say the goddess of talent would do, the Allegory of Inclination would do. This was initially a nude painting by Artemisia, but the gentleman who commissioned it, the grandnephew of Michelangelo, asked to have another artist paint over the private parts of the woman, so that it was not quite as worrisome, I guess, to the people who came to visit. This is a self-portrait as a lute player. There is documentation that Artemisia actually performed for the Medici, the women of the Medici household, the Medici family and the ladies in waiting, so to speak. The Medici family were wealthy merchants and not royalty, but certainly had an entourage. They don't know for sure that she played the lute, but it seems very likely that if she performed, she was playing the lute for these people. This particular painting also came down, its provenance came down through the Medici family. It was held in the family for quite several centuries. While she was in Florence, she was invited to become, Artemisia was invited to become a member of the Accademia of Design and Art. This was quite an honor for a woman. And in fact, Galileo also became a member of this Accademia. It was like arts and culture, so he was a scientist, and he was invited, but several years after Artemisia. Also, there's documentation that she was a friend of Galileo, so she hung out in high circles, let's say. Now, she had not been particularly well educated as a woman in Rome. It was not, women didn't go to school. If you were of a well-to-do family, you might have a tutor. But while she was in Florence, Artemisia taught herself to read and write, and she read philosophers so that she was able to converse at the salons and hold her own. And it seems from her popularity that she had a personality that was very winning, that she was able to succeed in cultured circles of the elite of that city. It was not untypical or atypical for a female artist to use herself as the subject. Now here she is shown, it's a self-portrait of as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Now think about it, she did not have access to models the way the men did, but she had access to mirrors, and so she was able to do a self-portrait just as she did in the previous one, which was a self-portrait of her with a lute, but here she's shown as Saint Catherine. Saint Catherine was a well-known martyr. She had been asked to marry the Persian king. She declined, and so he was going to have her killed by a wheel that had blades on it. You can see the wheel in her hand. As she was going to be killed with that, a thunderbolt came and broke up the wheel, and so she was saved. This palm that you see that she's holding, coming kind of out of her hand, but where her heart is a symbol of martyrdom. Also, you notice on her head there is a crown because St. Catherine actually came from a royal family and eventually became queen in that royal family. On the left, that small painting is the same topic, St. Catherine of Alexandria, this one by Caravaggio, and this one done about 15 years earlier. So again, Gentileschi, Artemisia Gentileschi would have been familiar very likely with this subject and possibly with this painting. The subjects that she painted, many of them, although these were well-known subjects that were painted by men, they are very violent, and there is always conjecture, let's say, that the women they're getting even with the men, and that this is Artemisia sort of working out her own trauma and working out her own angst against men. So again, on the left, there's a Caravaggio done in the 1602 or so, and the one on the right, about 20 years later, 15 to 20 years later, Judith slaying Holofernes. All of these, you can see the similarity in the way the light is treated, the way the background is very dark, the way there's the moment of dramatic action that is portrayed, and the subjects are close up to the up to the picture plane. Notice, however, Artemisia, she's got the sword and she's cutting his throat, but notice in the center, the maid who is holding down Holofernes is shown with mostly the top of her head showing, and her face is kind of foreshortened. So this is something that Caravaggio didn't do in his, but we're going to find more of this in Artemisia's work as we go along, these interesting angles that she portrays. In particular, this one, Judith and her maidservant. This is after Holofernes' head has been cut off and the maid is holding it in a basket, but they're looking off stage. This is after the moment of dramatic action, and they're worried about being seen and shown that they've done this deed. So they're looking away. Now the maidservant has her back to the viewer. Highly unusual for this to happen. Judith is shown in profile, so your eye is drawn to her. But the fact that the maidservant has her back to her, very, very unusual. Also notice that these pictures cut off, Artemisia has cut off Judith's arm. Judith's holding the sword over her shoulder, but her elbow is off stage, so to speak. Again, this is not a painting where I've cropped it. This is the way the painting is. This is the original size and the way it's portrayed. And another biblical story where a woman is getting the best of a man. This is Yael and Sisera. I'm not sure exactly, Sisera or Sisera. The Canaanites had been defeated by the Israelites, and this particular man from a tribe that had been friendly to the Canaanites sought refuge with the family or the husband of Yael, and he was invited into the home, and she, of course, played hostess. But when she had, after he had dinner and he got kind of drunk and was asleep, she killed him. She bopped him with a tent peg in his head and killed him. So that was her way of getting even. She was a Jewess, and then she showed the head of the Israelites that she had killed him. She was proud of her deed. In 1620, Artemisia and her husband went back to Rome, and she divorced him shortly after. But she spent some time in Rome, where again she had a great reputation. She had now been in the home of the Medicis in Florence, and people in Rome knew of her. Not only that, but they also knew her father, who lived still in Rome. And during that time, she had several private individuals asked to have their portraits done. So it was, again, very typical. And the two big patrons of the arts were private individuals who were of wealth or royalty, who could afford to hire somebody to do their portrait, or the church. The church would usually commission religious works, or it might be for the Pope or for the bishop, or maybe for a convent, or sometimes for a church. So these are the two groups that could afford to pay to have paintings done. So here is a wealthy woman. They think perhaps this is a picture of the Princess of Albania. And I show this one because it shows Artemisia's talents at portraying the great refinements of costume here. Look at the lace around the neck, look at the jewelry around the neck, look at all of the embroidery on the fine clothing that this woman-owned. Artemisia had a great deal of talent. Also, the artists of this period, one of the reasons they could attain this great realism in their work was in the early 1400s, 200 years earlier, oil painting had come into popularity. Before that, most of the paintings that were done with a sort of a gesso, a fresco type of painting. And that dried very fast, and it meant you had to move very quickly, and it didn't allow you to go back and paint over details. Well, oil painting stayed essentially kind of wet for a long period of time, and it allowed for you to blend colors very softly, very gently, and allowed you to go back and overpaint and put in a lot of detail that you couldn't have done if the paint were already dry, as you would with a fresco. So anyway, Artemisia used the medium to great effect in a painting such as this one. Here's another of a wealthy woman. Don't know who this one is, but she's shown very haughty, very sure of herself. So you can be assured she was a woman of great wealth and reputation in the community. It was easier for a female artist to paint women's portraits. It was not thought unseemly for Artemisia to go to the home of this woman or the princess and paint with the woman posing. Not so for her to paint men, because she would have therefore had to have had a chaperone with her, because it was not proper for a woman artist to be in the company of a man alone. However, Artemisia did do this. There is this one portrait of a Galfanoniere. He is thought to be a member of a group that was associated with the Pope to defend the Pope, of the Order of the Saints Maurice and Lazarus, a group that was sworn to defend the Pope. And up in the back, there's a banner that is part of a papal banner, and he's shown in all his finery of his knighthood, so to speak. Again, she was able to give you the sense of the medals, the ruff around his neck, etc., and an excellent portrait. You really get a sense this is an individual man here. And no doubt when she was doing this portrait, she had at least one chaperone keeping her company. While she was in Rome, she was presented, or her image was put on a coin done in the style of the ancient Roman coins. So this bronze medal was done in her honor, and this one is in the Frick collection. I have never seen it, but someday I hope maybe I can. Again, this shows that she was held in great reputation. Another, Judith and the Maidservant. I've shown these mostly in chronological order, so forgive me if it's the same subject that she did 10 years earlier. But here you can see both. The maid is turned sideways. You can't see her face really well. It's like you're looking down on her head because she's kneeling on the floor. And Judith is turned. You get her profile, but a good part of her face is in shadow. So this very dramatic, sort of stylized theatrical scene is played out here. And they're turned because maybe they hear a voice off in the distance and they're afraid they're going to be discovered. Artemisia did a couple of nudes. This is Sleeping Venus that she did, a fairly large painting. Done probably during the years that she and her husband lived in Venice. Now, notice they moved around a lot. Part of the reason was during this period, the plague was rampant. And when the plague would flare up in a city, the couple would move. And very likely the plague was in Rome. And so they went to Venice. Venice also being a very artistic city and one that would have welcomed Artemisia and her husband. Actually, she had divorced him by this time, I think. And another of Cleopatra. Although the subjects are sort of classical subjects or historical subjects, they're really excuses for Artemisia to paint nudes, to explore how to do this. And again, researchers think perhaps she used her own body as the model for these paintings, but that's just conjecture. Another religious piece, David with the Head of Goliath by Artemisia on the left, and one by another artist, Domenico Fetti, on the right. These two are very, very similar, so no doubt she was familiar with the Fetti painting and kind of copied the composition. So we have David leaning on the sword, much as the other. The difference, his legs are crossed and he kind of is looking out. In my opinion, not a great painting, but I just wanted to show that she was aware of the work of other artists when they were doing similar topics, subjects. And notice the face here of this person, a little more generic than, for instance, the knight that was to defend the Pope, or the women that we saw, which were very specific. This one looks a little more generic, so perhaps this was made up out of her imagination, or maybe a brother of hers that she remembered. And here, Esther before Ahasuerus. This is another biblical story, and this one in particular, I want to point out that it's Renaissance and Baroque painting clothing that is portrayed here. It's not ancient clothing from the biblical times. Particularly the man, you can see, is kind of Elizabethan in the way it looks. And again, the story is a biblical one where the Jews were going to be killed by Ahasuerus's military leader, and Esther, a Jew herself, was asked to petition her husband not to have the Jews killed. She dressed up in her finest clothing and she went into his room unannounced, and that was really a no-no. People who did that were usually put to death or at least arrested. When he responded that she could come in and meet with him, she swooned with relief. Here she is shown in that with her attendants holding her up. Anyway, she petitioned that the Jews should be spared, and they were. And ultimately, I think the military man was put to death. Someone had to be put to death in these stories, always. Interesting composition, because the center is kind of empty and the action is on either end, but the way the leg is pointing, the way the husband here, the king, is looking at his wife, her yellow dress, you really focus on her even though she's way off center. And Corsica and the satyr, a very diagonal composition. This is not something you would find in the Renaissance. Renaissance, they like to have things sort of in a triangle, a pyramid. But here there's movement where she's shown kind of running out of the picture plane. And again, a satyr lusting after her, and she's running away from him. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, went to London and worked on some things for the royalty there, and eventually asked her to join him there because he had quite a bit of work and he needed help. So this is a painting that went on the ceiling of a building that he was working on, one of the royal buildings. And in fact, it's Marlborough House. It was the Queen's house at the time. And this is a large piece that was put on the ceiling. It's mounted on a board. Now, I assume it was done on a board and then attached to the ceiling rather than painted on the ceiling, but I don't know enough about this piece to know for certain. Her father died the following year. You can see 1639, he died, and she stayed on in London because she herself had acquired some commissions, and I think he did too, and she stayed longer to finish things up, and then eventually went to Naples. However, while she was in London, she did this self-portrait as an allegory of painting, and she is shown sort of disheveled, her clothing falling off her shoulder. She's writing madly. The little Cupid is kind of holding things for her. So she's in sort of a frenzy. She was in London till 1642 and then went to Naples, and she died in Naples, probably from the plague, because 1654 to 56 were plague years in Naples. And the last self-portrait that we have as an allegory of painting that she did during the time she was in London. And this is a highly unusual painting. It's very Baroque, and again, it's brought up close to the picture plane, shows her in action, strong light and dark contrast, but take a look at how she's shown herself. You're looking down on her, so you don't see, it's not like here I am posed for this portrait. It shows her in action. You see a lot of her head, her hair, her face sort of in three-quarter profile, but tilted a little bit. So you look down on her head, on her chest, on her arm. And again, just I think a very interesting kind of composition. And by comparison, I put another Caravaggio on the left side because his conversion of St. Paul again shows a highly unusual composition where you're looking down on St. Paul, who was thrown off his horse in a swoon when he received the word of God, so to speak. So Artemisia was a talented woman. She was independent. She had enough work that she could support herself. She divorced her husband and did quite well by herself. She was courageous. She stuck up for herself under the pressure of a rape trial, and she was very successful. She had many people who sought out her talents. She worked in cities that had strong artistic environments, Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, and she competed very, very well in those circles. So she did very well for herself. Her artistic style is not a woman's style. It is very typical of the Baroque period, the shallow picture space like a stage set, images that were cut off or elbows not shown in the painting. There was asymmetry, dramatic moment, very dramatic lighting, chiaroscuro, action that's implied off stage, people turning, listening to see if there's something going on off stage, so to speak, as well as very elegant portraits and subject matter that was religious, that was very typical. So just a quick rundown here. Artemisia's style and the Baroque style generally built upon the lessons of the Renaissance, but became much more action-oriented and much more dramatic in the way they were portrayed. Education for women, you still had to learn how to be a painter by going to another artist, apprenticing to an artist, and working in their workshop. People who could afford to, like the Medicis, for instance, and the leading merchant families in Florence and in Mantua, for instance, and in Venice, would support the workshops of their favorite artists and give them work to support the artists themselves and their workshops. The workshops for apprentices were good for boys, but the girls really were not allowed to participate unless it was their father, their uncle, their brother, a close relative. The women, although Artemisia was given membership in the academy, in the Accademia in Florence, she was not allowed to go to meetings. She was not allowed to paint male nudes. She was not allowed to go to their lectures. Women still were expected to marry, some who didn't join the convent. But Artemisia made a way for herself. It's interesting that the artists that have been researched from this period, all of them that we have known of, or most anyway, were members of the Academy, which offered the women credentials and gave them a network for them to get commissions and therefore to be able to support themselves. They're usually the daughters of artists or the sisters of artists, and they usually are well enough off that they become the breadwinners in their families. They're very, very talented. Those, of course, are lesser talent we don't know about. Either they didn't make it and their artwork wasn't shown, or we haven't discovered it. And I think this is a field that's really still unfolding in terms of research. So I expect there'll be follow-up on these things as the next decades unroll. I put on here a bibliography. I always like to let people know things where you could learn more about this artist. There was a documentary done of her, which is not really great, but I think you can get it on YouTube if you search for Artemisia. It'll come up. And I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing. And
Thank you. Thank you so much, Georgie. That was absolutely marvelous. I knew nothing about that, and I thought that was just great. Since it's a little bit after 2, we probably will not do any questions. And unless someone would like to do that and stay on, but you would have to unmute yourself. One of the things I wanted to tell everybody, some very exciting news, which is that Mad About Art is now a 501c3 charitable organization. We filed for it last fall and we just received it. And the benefits of a 501c3, of course, are the prestige in the community. Also, you know, people can get tax exempt donations, and also if we purchase anything like we did for our Christmas party, it's all tax free. But I just want to let you know. So is there a question or two? If it is, just unmute yourself, maybe raise your hand and I will see you. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much again. Just to let everybody know, madaboutartdenver.com is our website, and everything has been recorded and will be on the website. Also, the beginning of each month, you will be receiving our March newsletter, which will have upcoming events that we hope you will attend. So thank you very much and have a wonderful March. Georgie, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I always enjoy doing these things, and it's nice to see my friends online. Thank you for supporting me.
Yes, and the first lecture she gave on monuments is on our website, so you can review that also, but thank you for the update.
Thanks, Georgie.
You're
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Bye.